Thank you, Fred, for those very kind words and a bit of an over-generous introduction, but it's really nice to be back here. Nice to be back in Washington. I think I first arrived in the city in 1968 when the Kennedy Center didn't exist. So I have a wonderful sense of coming back every now and then and see what's happening. You know, when I first agreed to come here, I was under the mistaken impression that Fred wanted me to talk about India, but he later on told me that we know all about India, and we probably won't believe exactly what you say. However, what we don't know about is how has the visit gone. So why don't you talk about the visit? And you can cram in a few comments on India at the end of it all. You know, I can kind of sympathize with that set of priorities because, I mean, I've been associated with prime ministerial visits in the past to Washington, and I think it's fair to say that the degree of interest that I see in this particular visit is much greater than in any other. This was, I was at the end of yesterday's dinner saying goodbye to the Prime Minister, or good night rather, to the Prime Minister as he went into his room or suite. And I said, you know, there's a lot more interest in the visit than has ever been the case before. And he said, no, I think you're just exaggerating. So I just happened to put on CNN. And there was Larry King Live, with a half-an-hour program on the dinner itself, where one substantial part of the screen was showing the toings and froings and the comings and goings. And the rest of the screen was a very extensive interview with the Swedish chef who had been called in to design the menu. And it was quite fascinating, actually, that I feel that when people come to our country, they should have a flavor of their own kind of spices. So then we learned that, you know, it wasn't actually Indian food, but it was fusionized with some Indian things, and quite a detailed examination. I felt that if CNN found it appropriate to advise the American public, and actually it must be advising the Indian public too, because we get CNN at home also, on this degree of detail, it's entirely reasonable for the Peterson Institute to get a little bit of an inside view on the less exciting parts of the visit. I think we were just chatting with Fred and Ambassador Meera Shankar, and I think she summarized it all when he asked her, how do you think it's gone? And she said that if I had to use one word, two words rather, very well. And I think that's my own impression. I think the visit went very well. It's very difficult to tell what are the sort of metrics by which you judge a visit. Obviously, the kind of personal chemistry, the vibes from the administration, the vibes from the president, the vibes from other people in Congress. And actually my impression, I mean, I was on the sidelines of a lot of these meetings. I think we have a good reason to believe that the visit went extremely well. It is, after all, the start of the administration. Fred tells me that it's the start. It's 7 more years to go of the Obama administration. So certainly, looking ahead, in our case, also it's the start of the second term of the UPA government. So it's quite a useful occasion to see where do we stand vis-a-vis the US, and do we have an agenda for cooperation. Now, as it happens, I was sitting in on the press conference that the Prime Minister had with the Indian press, which of course asked him about all kinds of things. And since that is what will get projected in India, let me just go over the issues which I think the Indian public would want to look at to judge whether the visit has gone well. I mean, it's quite clear that unlike the previous visit, which was kind of dominated by one big major initiative, which is the civil nuclear deal, this was not the kind of visit where that could happen, for no other reason because the existence of technology barriers associated with this discriminatory treatment of India was a unique phenomenon. I mean, there are lots of things we can do with the US, but there are no comparable obstacles. So this could not have been a one agreement kind of visit. But I think the press was very interested to know what signals did the administration give on completing the civil nuclear agreement. There are 2 or 3 things that have to be done to make it fully operational from the point of view of the US. It is actually operational vis-a-vis other countries anyway. And we were very pleased that President Obama quite categorically declared that he was committed to the completion of the civil nuclear agreement. So the sort of buzz which sometimes you got in the press, that with the change of administration, there may be less of a commitment to complete it, I believe that has been quite satisfactorily put at rest. As far as getting those little things done, I don't believe they pose any major problems. One issue that needed to be resolved was the introduction of civil liability legislation in India, which would actually limit the liability of suppliers in the event of a nuclear accident to a certain amount, and the rest would come out of some general insurance. The Cabinet has approved that legislation a week ago, and it will now go to Parliament. So I don't see that that's a problem. The rest is just a matter of, I think the Prime Minister described it as dotting I's and crossing T's, and I expect that to actually happen. So that's something done and will get completed and out of the way. We had very useful discussions, not involving me personally, except in 1 or 2 cases when I happened to be present. Obviously a comprehensive discussion on security-related aspects concerning the region, what is happening in terrorism, how can we collaborate better. We have been actually very pleased with the nature of the collaboration between India and the United States in the aftermath of the bomb blast in Mumbai on the 26th of November last year. And I think they have signed additional agreements, and that's quite significant, although from the economic point of view that never gets much attention. But that's an area where collaboration has been excellent, and I know that people on our side are quite looking forward to seeing more of that happen, which will certainly cement the relationship further. On other issues, the neighborhood, security issues, is more a question of discussion, and I think the Prime Minister would have conveyed, I know he has conveyed to almost everybody that he met, India's point of view on this issue. It's not something that requires a specific action in order to sort of come to closure. It's more a perception whether we have a common understanding of the nature of the problem, and I think we are persuaded that there is very substantial common ground in that area. On the economic front, the principal action which perhaps the US government has to take that would advance collaboration is removal of technology transfer controls. I mean, at the moment, under the dual-use technology criteria, India is not, partly as a hangover from the earlier nuclear discriminatory regime, many of our companies still have impediments put in their way in the matter of transfer of technology. We were assured by the US government that they are undertaking quite a high-level review of the technology restrictions that they have. I think their own perception seems to be that these restrictions are actually not achieving any security enhancement kind of concerns. And it's in the nature of dual-use technology that if you start restricting at all, you're really restricting a lot of economic interaction. So we are very hopeful that as a result of that review, there will be a significant easing of technology controls. Other than that, I mean, the Prime Minister on several occasions said that India is has benefited enormously from the policies of openness and integration with the global economy and encouragement of foreign investment and so forth. I don't know if any of you were present when he spoke at the US IBC meeting, and I apologize to those who were present for just mentioning, I think, what are the core points that he made, which we have repeated in bilateral meetings. And that is quite simply that in the 5 years before the global crisis, the Indian economy grew at an average growth rate of 9%. Now this for us was unprecedented, and we interpret it as the vindication of the policies of economic reforms introduced in 1991. You know, I know that Arvind Subramaniam here invariably mentions that they were actually introduced in 1980 and not in 1991. So since Arvind's looking at me, I don't actually mind. You said to me that nobody listens to Roderick Subramaniam. Personally, I think 1991 was the really big change. But since I came back to India in 1979, I've never strongly objected to your dating the change from 1980. But having said that, it is 1991 that you really got economic change done. And I think it, you know, I have said on other occasions, many people have said that India did these things in a very gradualist kind of way. And for there are many compulsions of Indian democracy that make that happen. It isn't really until in the previous 5 or 6 years that you really saw a spurt of growth. I mean, earlier there was sort of an acceleration, then loss of steam and whatever. But the 5 years before the global economic crisis, a 5-year record average of 9% was very heartening. And, you know, we interpret it, I think people in India also see that, as a vindication that the economic reforms are good for India, and India knows how to integrate with the world, and India has what it takes to do that, and so forth. Now, of course, the economic crisis has caused a slowdown, 6.7% in 2008-2009. We think it'll be around 6.5%, could be a little better in 2009-2010. I mean, our fiscal year ends at the end of March. And we think from the next year onward, we should go back above 7%. You know, every time I mention these numbers, somebody always, in India, somebody always tells me, but the World Bank and the IMF think it's going to be lower. And I keep telling them that if you make a comparison, the World Bank and the IMF have been under-predicting India's growth for the last 7 years. So really, if you tag on that forecasting error based on the past, I think what I'm saying will be more or less correct. I think most people think that the Indian economy will do better next year than this year, which is no big surprise. The real issue is, are we going to get back to 9%? And I just want to spend a few minutes to lay out at least the Indian perception on this. You know, our view is that, of course, the global slowdown and the loss of export demand, if you do a sources of growth on the demand side, would suggest that the capacity to grow is going to be that much less. But, you know, I tend to take more a kind of real economy view. I don't see anything that has happened which alters the sources of growth on the supply side. And I find that 90% of the discussion on growth and the linkage between the developing world and the developed world is all about where's the lost demand going to come from. And clearly, if there's an asset bubble and private demand has gone down in industrialized countries, been replaced by public demand, which you're now trying to phase out, which is also perhaps sensible, the general view is that the industrialized countries will be contributing much less to the growth of demand, and we accept that proposition. But we're looking at the other way around and saying that if you look at it on the sources of growth from the supply side, India has the capacity to grow at 9%. The question is, can we have a demand structure that will support the 9% growth? And I think our answer is that demand structure has to come by stimulating investment, and especially investment in infrastructure. Infrastructure, I think most people agree, is the one area where in relative to, compared to our endowment in most other dimensions, skilled labor, management, private sector, entrepreneurial traditions, soft infrastructure, all of that, infrastructure is what we don't have. So quite frankly, India, in my view, is well positioned to try to solve its demand deficiency problem by having a big push on investment in infrastructure. And we're doing it through a combination of public investment, which of course will be constrained by fiscal constraints, and a lot of public-private partnership. Now, this is another dimension where one could raise questions. I mean, is it feasible to get a lot of public-private partnership in infrastructure? And I think that's an occasion for a whole separate lecture. But I note the fact that many people in India tell us that we are being over-optimistic about how much public-private partnership we can get. So that's a big challenge, and both at the central government level and at the state government level, I think what's happened is that people buy the notion that we should go for public-private partnership, and a lot of experimentation is taking place in how to do that. So that's really, that's the strategy of why India should rely on the supply side capability and find the demand necessary to generate the growth, which on the supply side is now entirely feasible. And a lot of that has to do, obviously, with more reforms, more efficiency, using the existing resources more effectively, etc., etc. I think that there is enough political traction in the system to get these reforms done over time, not in a sort of very dramatic way where in the next 2 months we're going to announce something, but in a typically Indian sort of way where at any given time in India there is an enormous desire to have a target level of controversy. Calm, equilibrium, this is really, I mean, at any given time there is a desire to have a huge amount of controversy. But actually, as long as you keep that going, there's also an enormous boredom with having the same controversy. So I think you start some things, then people get bored about that, and they say, well, go on, get it done. We want to attack you on something else. So I think if you appreciate that, and I'm counting on this feature of democratic participation, it will allow a lot of the necessary reforms to take place. The Prime Minister mentioned infrastructure, tax reform, financial sector reforms, legal reform, which is a new and very important thing, which is just beginning. Because in our view, I think most people think the higher judiciary in India is uncorrupted, fair, independent of government, extremely important from a business point of view. And the biggest complaint is delay. And there are some very specific measures being taken that over the next 3 or 4 years will in fact lead to a significant reduction in these delays. And that's partly the use of IT in the court system, also special measures to recruit members of the judiciary to clear the backlog, and a whole lot of process-related changes which, if they get implemented in the next 3 or 4 years, can make a difference. So with all of these things, we think 9% growth is feasible. What we've said is we'll get back to it in about 2 years' time. Hopefully by then the world economy will be back to something like normal, but normal won't be what normal used to be. And that's really the big difference, that even though we believe that the industrialized world will be growing less rapidly than in the past, we should not regard that as a reason why we can't. Now, you could argue that with the loss of exports, and if we're going to raise investments, then clearly something has to give, and that something will be the need to finance all this through external flows. And it's true that if you do the sums, India will need to maintain a somewhat larger current account deficit than would otherwise have been the case. This, in my view, is being a responsible global citizen at a time when there's a huge demand deficiency. And I'm not talking about current account deficits that are out of this world. I mean, I'm talking about 2.5% of GDP, and quite frankly, given the limited number of countries that could claim to be in a position where they can grow rapidly, and right now India is the second fastest growing of the major developing country economies, and I don't see, I'm not saying we're going to become the fastest growing, because the fastest growing is growing at an incredible rate. So whether we become the fastest growing is going to depend not on us jacking up our growth rate, but on China's growth rate slowing down for whatever reason. That's not important. I mean, we're only concerned with how well we do. I think that It will mean a bigger fiscal deficit, and I believe that any system of allocating available global capital resources should find it sensible to invest, to finance a deficit of around 2.5% of GDP in an economy that's growing at 9% and consists of 1.2 billion people. I don't think that'll be difficult. The amounts are not large. The world is underinvested in India at present. So even if it took the next 10 years to rebalance its portfolio, if the industrialized world is going to grow much more slowly or just slowly, the differential between growth in India and growth in the industrialized world would justify a shift of capital which would enable us to support this domestic investment demand-led strategy, which is what we need in order to get to 9%. I just want to take 2 minutes to say that I'm not unaware of longer-term challenges. Obviously, energy is going to be a big issue. Related to that is the whole climate change thing, also water. And I think we just have to factor these in as new long-term challenges which we have to cope with. And I don't think we have any new way of coping with it. We'll probably watch what others are doing and learn and adopt best practices. But all of that is very long-term. Over the next 5, 6, 7 years, getting back to 9% is an entirely feasible proposition. So I think I've exceeded the time allotted to me. Maybe I should stop and take questions.